I think we've all heard by now about the terrible wreck last Tuesday, that 8 people were killed, 200 people were injured. And many of us have also seen how the capitalist media is trying to crucify the locomotive engineer, and that includes the New York Daily News, whose readership is overwhelmingly workers. And they just continue to attack the engineer, and no such thing as due process, or just trying to find out what really happened. There really is sort of a war. There's been a war against railroad workers. 1.2 million of their jobs have been destroyed in the last 65 years. The larger question is, why is the U.S. railroad system seemingly backward compared to almost every other industrialized country? I say seemingly because most people think, when they think of railroads, they think of passenger trains. Despite the labor of Amtrak workers, the passenger train system in the U.S. is woefully inadequate. The establishment of Amtrak in 1971 meant that they got rid of, at the time, half of the existing passenger trains, which had already been diminished. LBJ helped put a stake into the railroad system when he took so much of the mail contracts off for delivery of boxes and whatnot in 1967. But U.S. railroads still carry a higher percentage of freight than railroads in Western Europe. The Union Pacific, on its main line in Nebraska, had to add a third track to handle 150 freight trains a day. That's more than one every 10 minutes. So we know that railroads are indispensable to the capitalist economy. During the last coast-to-coast railroad strike in 1991, Congress immediately passed legislation to crush it. George Herbert Walker Bush was woken up in the White House to sign it within 24 hours of this bill being dropped in the congressional hopper. But railroads have declined, and their decline is linked to deindustrialization. The biggest railroad freight shipments out of New York City now are garbage trains. I give them signals on my job as a dispatcher. Take a trip south of Newark on NJ Transit or Amtrak. You'll see miles of abandoned factories, no boxcars. You may see some old railroad sidings broken up, but no boxcars. The railroad system is shriveled, and so has railroad employment. And this has been a brutal rationalization. At its peak, the U.S. railroad system was more than 250,000 miles of track. Now, a lot of this was just based on speculation. Capitalist speculation wasn't meant to serve a certain city or anything like that. Sort of a well-known example was the old nickel plate railroad. It was deliberately built by capitalists to extort money from the Vanderbilts that owned the New York Central, because they would threaten the rate war. This was before the establishment of the Interstate Commerce Commission in 1887. And at the last minute, William Vanderbilt, son of Cornelius, he gave in and gave $8 million just about before they're going to declare bankruptcy. So here's a railroad that was built simply for the reason of extortion. The funny thing about it, became part of the mergers of the 1960s. It became part of the Norfolk and Western, which is now the Norfolk and Southern. And this railroad is still in existence, while the old Fort Wayne, Chicago, Fort Wayne, and Pittsburgh, which became part of the Pennsylvania, which was this super main line, is now a secondary line. And that's how irrational it is. In the last, just in the last 50 years, between 1980 and 2000, 80,000 miles of railroad track were abandoned. 12,000 miles were abandoned between 1975 and 1980. The number of railroad workers in the United States that was once 2.2 million in 1920 and went to 1.5 million in 1947, 862,000 in 1960, 617,000 in 1970. A whole series of railroad towns were devastated. Especially affected were towns with railroad shops that were shut down or downgraded, like Livingston, Montana, where the great shops in the Northern Pacific were located, or the Paducah, Kentucky shops at Illinois Central. Altoona, Pennsylvania, for example, had a workforce of 18,000 workers in World War II. Now it's below 2,000. Today there's just 7 railroad companies that control over 90% of rail freight. A little more than 160,000 workers are employed by the 7 rail Goliaths. That's less than either the Pennsylvania Railroad or the New York Central, each employed in 1929. A pivotal event in the history of capitalist railroads in the U.S. was the Penn Central fiasco. That was one of the biggest mergers, and when they went bankrupt in 1970, that was the biggest bankruptcy up to that time. And it was these capitalist railroad bosses were so inefficient that the entire potato crop from Maine was lost. They used to ship all their potatoes by railroad, or virtually all of them, and it was just lost. They missed the cars, and so it spoiled. And so that's a whole section of business that they lost. The capitalist government not only took the passenger business off railroads back by setting up Amtrak, it was also forced to take over almost all the Northeast railroads and much of the Midwest railroads after the Penn Central bankruptcy. The government pumped in almost $8 billion into Conrail. That's our money. That's worth at least $30 billion today, before the Reagan administration sold it off in a fire sale for less than $2 billion, less than 25 cents on a dollar. I remember 30 years ago I had to give signals to the CEO of Conrail. His name was Stanley Crane. He had a whole string of private business cars, these luxurious cars, and he was on the old Center Street branch in Harrison, New Jersey. I was operating a signal tower called Hudson, and you had to cross both the PATH tracks and the Amtrak tracks. And I had to wait for an Amtrak train. I was not going to put him in front of a revenue train. So he gets on the radio, starts complaining. That's how those railroad bosses are. Now, there's since been a revival of capitalist railroads at the cost of railroad workers. Deregulation has been a tremendous weapon against the labor movement. It was first done with airline workers under the Carter administration, the Democratic administration in 1978. Then with the trucking industry in 1980, when the great defeats of labor is how they've downsized the Teamsters Union with all the cutbacks. And by the way, many railroad workers today are proud members of the Teamsters, including the locomotive engineers and the maintenance way employees. Chris Silvera's union, Teamsters Local, represents, among other workers, the Metro North track workers. Now, a big defeat comparable to PATCO was the destruction of the Rock Island Railroad, an important Midwestern railroad. Earlier was the smashing of the unions of the Florida East Coast Railroad, starting in 1963. Now, this railroad was started by a guy by the name of Flagner. He was a co-partner of one of the great criminals in the United States called John D. Rockefeller. So this is Standard Oil money that helped develop Florida. And he actually built an extension to Key West that was destroyed in a hurricane in 1935. And the reason why I mention this is that it was built by peon, basically semi-slave labor, peon labor. People were forced there because of debt. And the Wilson administration, of course, didn't do anything. And this strike destroyed the unions there. And just to show you how slimy strikebreakers are, one of them was a man by the name of William Calley, who crossed the picket line, destroyed the union, and later on, he was a war criminal at My Lai. And he spent like 10 hours in jail for being convicted of killing 500 people. Nixon let him off. The 1987 Staggers Act was deregulating railroads and let private rail do almost anything they wanted. The Interstate Commerce Commission was abolished. The statistics that used to be collected by the ICC, now they're collected by the Association of American Railroads, this private, outfit, lobbying for the railroad bosses. Now, a whole series of parasites got in. Billionaire Warren Buffett told Bloomberg Businessweek that he bought the Burlington Northern Santa Fe, which of course itself is a huge merger. I mean, it was made up of these gigantic railroad lines, including the Burlington, the Northern Pacific, the Great Northern, the Santa Fe, because he read where railroad employment has dropped from 1.2 million by 1.2 million workers since 1947. Now, Buffett isn't considered such an open reactionary. He even says, well, maybe I ought to pay some more taxes. Some think he's even some sort of liberal. He's got a fortune of $71 billion, and he just said that a minimum wage increase won't help the working class. Well, besides being stupid, he's also a sociopath. What happened to those 1.2 million workers? Look at Hamlet, North Carolina, a railroad town that's still a division point on CSX. It used to be part of the Seaboard, with a very important yard in eastern North Carolina. Black women who could have gotten railroad jobs there were forced to work for chicken boss Emmett Rowe at the Imperial Food Sweatshop. The owner, Emmett Rowe, locked the doors because he thought these black workers would steal the chickens. That's the sort of racist he was. Because of this, locked doors on September 3rd, 1991, a fire broke out, 25 workers were killed, many of them burned to death. Brenda Stokely worked along with many others to help convict this pig. And only because of this he was jailed, but he was jailed for less than 4 years for 25 murders. Another parasite is this guy, Edward Arnold Burkhart. He's the boss of the Maine and Atlantic Railroad that operates a former Canadian Pacific Railroad through northern Maine. I actually rode on this line in 1967 when it carried the Atlantic Limited, the Canadian Pacific's Atlantic Limited from Montreal to St. John, New Brunswick. And Burkhart operates the railroad, one-person crews. And what happened was that horrible explosion in Quebec that killed 47 people. Before that, he took parts of the Sioux line away, called it the Wisconsin Central, ran it as a non-union outfit until the unions got back in there. Still another parasite is Timothy Mellon, owner of the Pan American Railways. That's the former Boston and Maine, which has still a lot of commuter businesses now, the MBPTA out of North Station in Boston and Maine Central. Viciously anti-union. Tim gave $1.5 million to defend in court the fascist Arizona anti-immigrant law, SB 1070. Now, he's a son of Paul Mellon, who spent his entire life collecting paintings. And Paul Mellon appropriately called his autobiography Life in a Silver Spoon. And he's a grandson of that big crook Andrew Mellon, who after spending the longest term as Treasury Secretary, demanded to be named ambassador to Britain to the Court of St. James's, where he spent a year negotiating, getting half the oil out of Kuwait for his family's Gulf Oil Company. In other words, basically laying the groundwork for the U.S. invasion of Iraq 60 years later. Now, Buffett and the Association of American Railroads like to brag how much money they're spending on railroads, railroad capital expenditures, rails, bridges, new locomotives. Last year, BNSF spent $6 billion fixing the track and buying more locomotives. But just $200 million of that was spent on positive train control, this absolutely necessary safety measure. Only 1 out of every $30. Yet the railroad executives are screaming they can't make the deadline. Now, the whole U.S. railroad industry says they're going to spend $29 billion in capital expenditures in 2015. That's a lot of money. But last year, socialist China spent $128 billion. $100 billion more money. That's over 4 times as much. And China built 4,000 miles of new railroad to serve its, population. Now, railroads used to be the biggest business in the United States. Their stocks dominated the New York Stock Exchange 100 years ago. The Pennsylvania Railroad was the world's largest corporation until U.S. Steel was formed by bankster J.P. Morgan in 1900. And Morgan himself controlled a whole series of railroads, as a bunch of other big capitalists. The biggest financial angel of the Democratic Party for decades was the Harrimans, like Governor Harriman in New York, who began to negotiate the Vietnam peace talks. Well, he owned the Union Pacific, Southern Pacific, and Illinois Central. And Lenin, in his book on imperialism, talked about how important investments in railroads were, particularly to British imperialism. Marx pointed out earlier in his writings in the Horace Greeley's Tribune about how the British were building railroads like the Romans built roads to control the population, but he said, you got to develop a working class to do it. You got to have mechanics, you got to have people to make things, and you're really laying the basis for a new revolution. And railroads were the first really large employer of labor in the U.S. In 1860, the largest textile mill only had 800 workers, and both the Erie and Pennsylvania railroads, which were relatively new at the time, only had over 4,000. And the railroad bosses operated them like the Army. Sections of the railroad were called divisions. If you gave a message to a railroad, it was a train order. There were huge class struggles. 1877, railroad workers burnt down Pittsburgh. The head of the Pennsylvania Railroad declared, put them on a rifle diet to the striking workers. Workers were shot down in Baltimore. 1894, there was the Great Pullman Strike led by Debs. But the Pullman workers, Pullman porters, weren't organized. The American Railroad Union barred black workers from joining. Debs was against it, to his credit. But he failed in a vote by 112 to 100 to admit black workers to this union. Fundamental thing of unity. What Deb should have done was walked out. That would have been a greater thing than leading the Pullman strike. 30 years later, he spoke to an audience in Harlem. He said that's one of the things that defeated the strike. He recognized that. It's interesting that W.B. Du Bois, who later at the end of his life joined the Communist Party, and he was in, I believe, Germany at the time studying, but nevertheless, he doesn't even mention this great strike that just galvanized the whole country in his autobiography. The racist hiring by railroads. I think the last locomotive engineer until the 60s, late 60s, was in 1915, was backed by the unions. They almost all had Jim Crow clauses. Charles Hamilton Houston, a great figure in the freedom movement, who mentored Thurgood Marshall. Many of his cases involved fighting discrimination in the unions. We all know A. Philip Randolph organized the Pullman Porters. It was E.D. Nixon, a Pullman porter, that organized the Montgomery bus boycott. The leader who organized the dining car workers was a member of the Communist Party. His name was Ishmael Flores. In fact, he used to come up, I used to belong to the Angela Davis Committee in Milwaukee. He used to come up from Chicago. Now, there has been a long decline in the railroad, and what's linked to is an economic law called the law of the tendency of the rate of profit to decline. Karl Marx called this the most important law in political economy, and what it simply is take some outfit like CVS. They're trying to get rid of their clerks. These automated checkout places. Okay, they're going to think, hey, we're going to make some money. We can get rid of workers, right? But you know, capitalists, they don't really, I mean, they sort of know they got to exploit workers, but they don't base what they get on exploitation and the rate, what we call the rate of surplus value. What they base it on is on what they invested in. And so what they've done is they've added tens or hundreds of millions of dollars to their investment, and so the rate tends, there's a tendency, there's counteracting influences, as Marx points out in the following chapter, but it tends to decline historically, and that's what happened with railroads. Engels didn't even include railroads in what's called the average rate of profit, and the capitalists just stripped the railroads. I mean, an example is, in 1932, at the very bottom of the recession, of the Great Depression, let's see where I have it here. I don't have it here. The Great Depression, they milked $525 million from railroads in debt payments for bonds. Now, this is equal in inflation to $9 billion today, but if you calculate it against the size of the whole economy, like the gross national product, they'll be worth over $180 billion. This is how much money they get. And by the way, it shows you how much, how important it is, the concept of surplus value. You know, it sounds sort of complex. And why we sometimes talk about that instead of profit, is it just because it's a fancy word? No. We say the only place where the capitalist class can get really profit from is from living labor value. Sure, you know, a salesman or something, if you buy low, sell high, you make a profit. But ultimately, it comes from living, the labor power that has to be sold is the only thing that workers have to sell in the capitalist market. And the difference between the value of their labor and what they get, that is surplus value. And so the capitalists, even when, you know, many of the railroads would be in receivership or whatever, they would still milk billions of dollars because of debt payments, you know, interest on the bonds. That's surplus value and whatnot. So just to sum up today, railroad workers, even though they're much smaller, were also much more powerful. On a world scale, it's coming back. For example, railroads was the basis of the Communist Party in Sudan. For example, the whole drive against railroad workers in the U.S., it was even worse in the colonial world, particularly in Latin America. So-called neoliberalism, a laissez-faire. Like, for example, they've cut out thousands of miles of railroad in Argentina, particularly passenger trains. Mexico, they did the same thing. Mexico, many of the passenger cars that were abandoned here, the Mexican government would buy it up in the 60s. They had one train between Mexico City and Monterrey. It was made up of former cars of the 20th Century Limited that used to leave Grand Central Terminal every day in a red carpet. That's where the term red carpet originates, by the way. And they've eliminated them. Well, the government of Argentina just this spring renationalized the Argentine railroads. They said, enough of these private owners. They're milking the country. We got to bring back railroads. And U.S. railroad workers are stronger. because also because we are much more multinational, because of all the struggles by Charles Houston and so many other fighters, that even with a diminished employment, we much more reflect the working class today. That if there's a picket line of railroad workers, oppressed people will be much more identify with us. So these are some of the questions behind the Amtrak crash. Again, don't believe the capitalist media. They're lies, and we have to go forward. Thank you.